You think you are smart because you plan everything. Every difficult conversation gets rehearsed in your head before it happens. Every career decision gets analyzed from 12 different angles before you make a move. You run the chess match in your mind before the game even starts, mapping every possible response, every mistake you might make, every way it could go wrong. You call this being strategic. You call it preparation. But here is the question that should stop you cold. What if your brain isn't preparing at all? What if it's eating you alive right now while you read this? What if you are trapped in a cage built entirely from your own thoughts, running scenarios that will never happen while your actual life moves past you? Today, we are looking at a story about a man who was tortured not with pain, but with too much thinking. By the end of this video, you will stop planning and start living. You will finally face the quiet, my friend. First question. Why do we run to a screen or a book the second our mind has nothing to do? Stefan Zweig wrote The Royal Game in 1941. It was the last thing he completed before his death, and what makes it feel like it was written yesterday is that the torture at its center is not physical. It has no blood, no violence, no dramatic suffering. The horror in this book is silence, emptiness, the specific agony of a sophisticated human mind with absolutely nothing to work on. And the way the main character responds to that horror is something most of us do every single day, just in smaller doses and with less catastrophic results. The main character is Dr. B, an Austrian lawyer, cultured and intelligent, a man who has spent his whole life in the flow of real events, real people, real problems to solve. And then the Gestapo arrests him. Picture this. Not a dark cell, not chains, a clean hotel room, comfortable furniture. The Gestapo's cruelest innovation for breaking certain kinds of people was not violence, it was nothing. No books, no newspapers, no sound from the outside world, no human face except for the brief, cold visit of the interrogators. The room was perfectly ordinary and completely empty of everything that makes existence bearable. They called it isolation. The clinical word doesn't capture what it actually does to a brain that needs input to stay sane. And Dr. B's brain starts to eat itself. How does our intelligence, which we think is our weapon, turn into our torturer when we are alone? Because a sharp mind with nothing to cut becomes a blade turned inward. Dr. B is not a simple person who can sit comfortably in blankness. He is someone who is always engaged, always analyzed, always had something to push against. In that hotel room, the pushing turns inward. He replays memories until they distort. He traces cracks in the ceiling. His thoughts circle without resolution. The very capacity for complex thinking that made him exceptional in the real world makes the silence unbearable. A less intelligent person might have found a way to go numb. Dr. B cannot stop thinking, and there is nothing good to think about. He survives this for months. And then the turning point, waiting outside an interrogation room, his hand finds a pocket belonging to a guard. He steals something without knowing what it is. He gets back to his room, opens it in the dark, and discovers a book. He expects a novel, a newspaper, anything. What he finds is a chess manual. 150 recorded championship games, presented in dry technical notation, moves and countermoves. No story, no drama, a catalog of chess. At first, he is disappointed, almost offended. What happens when the very thing that saves you from boredom becomes the monster that eats your sanity? Because the chess book saves him. His brain latches onto it with the desperation of a drowning person grabbing a rope. He starts memorizing the games. Move by move, game by game, he reconstructs them in his imagination without a board, using the pure internal space of his mind to hold the positions and play them forward. He builds a world inside his head, a world with rules, with patterns that reward attention, with an internal logic that the real world, the arbitrary, random, cruel real world of that hotel room completely lacks. And it works. He is no longer staring at the ceiling, slowly losing contact with reality. He is somewhere else. A world of 64 squares, where intelligence actually means something, where effort produces results, where the mind has something real to bite into. But the world in his head is also starting to feel more real than the one outside it. Why is preferring a perfect mental fantasy over a messy reality the ultimate form of self-sabotage? Because the internal world has a fatal advantage. It is clean. It follows rules you understand. It rewards you reliably. The real world is chaotic and uncooperative, and full of other people who don't follow your mental script. The chess world Dr. B is building inside the hotel room is completely under his control. Every position makes sense. Every game has a logic. Every mistake can be reviewed and understood. Reality doesn't offer any of that. Reality is the interrogators who won't tell him what they want to know, the room that never changes, the silence that offers no information about when or whether anything will change. He memorizes all 150 games, every single one. And now the problem is that his brain, having found its salvation, desperately needs more. Going back to the void is not possible. The chess world has to keep expanding, so it does the only thing available to it. He starts playing against himself. How does splitting your mind to play both sides actually lead to total collapse? Think about what this genuinely requires. To play white, you need to plan. To then play black effectively, you have to know what white is planning and work against it. But you are white. So you have to become black enough to genuinely threaten white, while simultaneously being white enough to defend against black. You have to be two separate strategic intelligences inside one skull. You have to trick yourself. You have to hold two completely opposed mental identities simultaneously and keep them from contaminating each other. This is what full-scale overthinking does. You play your own move and their likely response, and your response to that, and their response to yours, and at some point you are not one person thinking through a problem. You are a committee of voices, each one holding a different version of events, each one generating pressure, none of them agreeing, all of them running at the same time. Dr. B calls it chess poisoning. The split between black and white stops being a useful mental exercise. It becomes a genuine fracture. He loses track of which self is real. The line between the game inside his head and the world outside the game begins to dissolve. He collapses. He ends up in a medical facility, barely functional, and the Gestapo releases him because he is no longer a person they can interrogate. He swears off chess entirely. Why do we refuse to sit in a quiet room and simply be? Dr. B answers this for us. Because sitting in quiet means confronting whatever is actually there. For him, the quiet held the void, and the void was where the fracture started. The chess was the only rope he had. It held him up, and it also, eventually, started to strangle him. So he does what we all do after something has cost us more than we can afford to keep paying. He stops reaching for it. He builds a life that doesn't include the thing that nearly destroyed him. He tries to be a person who is simply present in reality without retreating into an elaborate internal universe. It works. For years, and then he boards a ship. What are you actually avoiding when you fill your quiet time with scenarios, plans, and worries? On the ship there is a celebrity, Chentovic, the current world chess champion. Chentovic is a deeply strange human being. Not because he is brilliant in any broad sense. He is not interesting, not cultured, not articulate. He is commercially focused, contemptuous of the people around him, not someone you would want to spend an hour talking to. But on a chessboard, he is a machine. His style has no artistry, no beauty. He wins through patience. Absolute, relentless, inhuman patience. He sits in a position and he waits. He has no internal drama, no anxiety. He is pure mechanical pressure, the chess equivalent of a slow-moving wall. Dr. B watches him play a group of amateurs, and something wakes up without his permission. The chess-trained part of his mind, the part he thought he had shut down, starts analyzing the position automatically. He makes a suggestion, then another. He sees things Chentovic's playing hasn't accounted for. A real match is arranged. How does complex intellectualism get destroyed when it slams into brutal, crude reality? The first game, Dr. B wins, and he wins beautifully. His chess is artistic. The chess of someone who spent months in solitary confinement building an entire internal world from pure logic, memorizing masterworks of strategic thought, feeling the deep structural patterns of the game in a way that most players never reach. He sees combinations several moves ahead. He plays with a speed and elegance that leaves Chentovich visibly irritated. The audience is amazed. Dr. B is clearly the more impressive mind. Clearly. Why is analysis paralysis the absolute worst strategy for success? Because Dr. B's chess has never had to survive contact with genuine resistance. In the hotel room, he played against himself. Against an opponent who shared his blind spots, who lost when he needed to lose, who never introduced truly alien logic into the game because the opponent was him. He built something extraordinary inside a sealed environment. And sealed environments don't prepare you for Chentovic. The second game starts. Chentovic does one thing. He slows down, dramatically. Not because he is confused or struggling, because he understands, on some instinctual level, that Dr. B's mind is fast and self-referential and needs momentum to function. Slowness starves it. Chentovic takes 10 minutes per move, sometimes more. He stares at the board with complete blankness and sits there. He has nothing inside him that gets restless. He is not performing patience. He simply doesn't feel the pressure of time the way a human being does. He is a machine, and machines don't suffer silence. Dr. B starts to feel it, badly. With nothing real to process between moves, his mind starts generating. And what it generates is not the actual game on the board in front of him. The hotel room chess starts bleeding through. The memorized games, the imaginary positions, the black versus white split that nearly broke him years ago, the real board and the mental board begin to overlap. He sees both simultaneously and they don't match. He plays a move. An observer quietly tells him the move isn't legal, not in the game being played on the real board between real people. It might be correct inside whatever position is running in his mind. But in reality, on the actual board, it makes no sense. His internal world has overwritten the external one. The fracture has reopened. He has to be removed from the game. Chentovic, barely interested, walks away. He didn't win by being smarter, he won by being present. By being slow and crude and completely real, immune to any beautiful internal universe because he has no internal universe to speak of. The machine defeated the genius by refusing to play the genius's game and insisting on playing the only game that actually exists, which is the one happening right now on the real board in the real world. If you turned off all the noise in your head today, what would you actually find in the quiet tomorrow? This is the question the book leaves you sitting with. Dr. B built something extraordinary in the silence. A whole internal world, a chess mind of rare depth, built from desperation and necessity, and the absolute refusal to surrender to nothingness. And the internal world became the problem. It became more comfortable and more reliable and more rewarding than any real game could ever be. Real games have Chentovics in them. Slow, crude, patient, completely indifferent to your internal drama. Real games don't follow the patterns you memorized. Real games don't cooperate with your analysis. Let's be honest about what you actually do when you overthink. You don't prepare. You build a mental world that is cleaner and more under your control than the real one. You run the conversation in your head until you have perfected your responses. And then the real conversation happens and the other person says something you didn't anticipate and you freeze, because the real person isn't reading from the script you prepared. You mapped out the career move until it was flawless and then you didn't make it, because the real version will have friction in it and friction wasn't in the plan. You are playing black and white simultaneously. You are splitting your own strategic intelligence against itself, generating pressure from multiple directions and calling it thinking. What it actually is the hotel room. You built it yourself. Nobody locked you in. You walked in and closed the door because the silence inside, even with all the circular noise you generate to fill it, feels safer than the messiness of making actual moves in actual reality. Chentovic won, not through beauty, through presence. He was in the real game, making real moves, unaffected by any parallel universe running alongside it. The internal world Dr. B constructed was extraordinary, and it destroyed him the moment he tried to use it against something genuinely outside himself. The quiet you've been avoiding has nothing sinister in it. It's not the Gestapo's hotel room. There is no void waiting to swallow you. There is an absence of noise. And in that absence, If you can stay in it without immediately filling it with scenarios and plans and rehearsals, there might be something that tells you what you actually think. Not what you're worried about, not what you're preparing for, what you actually, right now, want to do. Stop playing against yourself. Get on the real board. Make the move. The quiet is waiting, and unlike Chentovic, it's not going to just walk away.